When the fence first went up, I tried to tell myself I was probably overreacting. That's the truth. I walked outside one evening, looked toward the back corner of my yard, and saw fresh cedar panels where there had never been any before. New posts, clean lines. Everything looked expensive and professionally installed. For a second, I thought maybe it was just the angle. New structures can do that. They change how space feels. They make familiar things look slightly off until your eyes adjust. So I stood there longer than I should have, coffee in one hand, trying to decide whether the fence was actually in the wrong place, or whether my brain just didn't like change by the next morning. I knew it wasn't my imagination. I've lived in that house for almost 10 years. It's not a big place. Just a modest single-story home in an older neighborhood outside Cincinnati. Nothing flashy, nothing custom, nothing anyone would drive past twice. But it's mine. And after enough years in one place, you know the shape of your property without needing a map every morning? You know where the grass usually stays damp after rain? You know where the mower catches on a root? You know exactly how far the yard runs before the tree line begins. That kind of familiarity doesn't come from paperwork. It comes from living in a place long enough that it becomes part of your body. Memory, my backyard had always had a kind of natural boundary. Not a formal one, not the sort that satisfies people who need everything boxed and labeled, but enough. There were 2 old maples near the rear edge, and the previous owner had once shown me the original survey during closing and pointed out roughly where the line ran between them and the neighboring lot. I didn't memorize the measurements for fun, but I remembered the landmarks. Over the years, I planted along that edge, stacked leaves there in the fall, and ran my mower across it enough times to know where the ground started to slope. The line wasn't mysterious to me. Then the family behind me sold their house. The new owners were younger, maybe mid-30s, and from the start, they had the energy of people arriving with plans instead of settling in. Before they'd even unpacked properly, there were trucks in the driveway. Landscapers, roofers, contractors, someone measuring the patio, someone else carrying samples of stone and siding. Their place went from plain suburban to we watch renovation shows and have opinions about outdoor spaces in about 3 weeks. Again, none of that bothered me. People can do what they want with their property. Paint it black, add shutters, build a pergola, whatever. I'm not one of those neighbors who stares through blinds all day, looking for reasons to care. But then the fence crew showed up, big trailer. Cedar panels stacked in bundles. Post, hole, auger. For men working quickly like they had a full schedule and no intention of talking to anyone unless forced. I noticed because the work line looked close to my yard, but I still didn't go over there at first. I figured they had a survey, permits if needed. All the boring groundwork people are supposed to do before they start driving posts into the earth. I assumed competence. That was my first mistake. By evening, the fence was up, tall, clean, sharp-looking, and sitting farther into my side of the rear line than anything in that yard had ever sat before. The next morning, I grabbed a tape measure. There was a particular point I used as a reference. A spot near the back corner where a shallow garden bed ended and the old maple stood beyond it. Years ago, I had checked the distance from that point against the survey because I was planning a shed and wanted to know how much room I had. I remembered the number roughly. More importantly, I remembered what the space felt like. When I stretched the tape toward the new fence, it came up short enough to make my stomach drop. I measured again. Same result. I went inside, pulled out my old closing folder, and started digging until I found the survey. Then I carried it back outside and stood there in the morning light. Comparing the black lines on the paper to the cedar wall, someone had dropped into my backyard like they were claiming land in the 1800s. It wasn't even close. They hadn't drifted over by a few inches because a post got misaligned. They had built the whole fence first, and apparently planned to sort out whether it belonged there later. At best, it was lazy. At worst, it was deliberate. Either way, part of my yard was now sitting on the other side of somebody else's finished project. So I walked around to their front door. The husband answered, friendly enough in the way people are when they don't yet understand why you're there. I pointed out that the new fence looked like it had been built over the property line and said, I wanted to compare surveys before the crew got too far gone. He didn't look alarmed. That was the first bad sign. He didn't even really look curious. He just glanced over my shoulder toward the backyard like the answer might be, floating in the air, and said their fence guy had marked everything out. I asked if he had a survey. He said not on hand. I asked if the installers had used one. He said he assumed. So assumed that word did a lot of work in that conversation. I kept my tone even and told him my survey showed the line farther back and that the fence needed to be checked before this turned into something bigger. He sort of shrugged and said, if there was a slight discrepancy, they could figure it out later. Slight discrepancy. That was his phrase. Like we were discussing a paint color and not wear one. Property legally ended, and another began. I told him later wasn't good enough. He said, the crew was already paid and the fence was already in. That was the moment the whole thing changed for me. Because up until then, I had been trying to treat it like a mistake. But once someone knows there's a problem, and their first instinct is to protect the finished work instead of the correct boundary, it stops being an accident. It becomes a choice. I went back inside and called a licensed surveyor, not the city, not an attorney. I wanted one clean, professional answer from someone whose entire job was figuring out where lines actually belonged. He came out 2 days later. Older guy. Quiet. The kind of person who doesn't waste words because the equipment does the speaking for him. He spent half the morning checking corner markers, running lines, comparing records, and doing all the things the fence crew clearly hadn't bothered to do. Then he planted orange flags, one after another straight through the line where the new fence should not have been. I'll admit there was something almost cinematic about it. Fresh cedar panels on one side, bright orange flags cutting across the logic of them on the other, a visible argument between assumption and fact. The neighbors came out halfway through, first the wife, then the husband. They stood there on their patio watching this man slowly reduce their confidence to geometry. Nobody yelled. Nobody needed to. The flags did all the talking. When the surveyor finished, he handed me the preliminary notes and told me, in the calmest tone possible, that the fence crossed onto my property by just under 6 feet at the rear corner and tapered slightly from there. That was enough. More than enough. 6 feet doesn't sound like much until it's yours and someone else has boxed it in with wood and concrete. I thanked him, got the formal paperwork emailed that afternoon, and went back to the neighbors with a copy. The husband looked annoyed before I said a word. I held out the survey and told him the fence had to move. He took the pages, skimmed them with the kind of careless glance people use when they're hoping the facts will somehow become optional if they don't read too closely, and then said something that still irritates me to think about. He said, well, the fence is already built. I remember just looking at him for a second, because I genuinely didn't know how to respond to that level of uselessness. As if construction itself changed ownership. As if once a mistake becomes expensive enough, the person harmed is supposed to quietly accept it out of politeness. I told him that didn't matter. Wrong was wrong before the boards went in, wrong while the posts were drying, and wrong now. He said moving it would be costly. I said that sounded like something he should have thought about before building on land he didn't own. He didn't like that. The wife stepped in and tried a softer angle. She said they genuinely thought the line was farther over. I told her then they should have checked before building the fence first, and looking for the property line later. That phrase stuck, mostly because it was the cleanest way to describe what they had done. From there, things settled into that ugly middle stage every property dispute seems to have. Too serious to ignore. Not yet formal enough to force action. I documented everything. Photos from multiple angles. Copies of my original survey and the new one. Notes from the conversation. Dates, times. If I've learned anything from dealing with people who think confidence can substitute for evidence, it's that paper matters. For about a week, nothing happened. The fence stayed where it was. The neighbors acted like they were looking into options. which is really just the polite suburban version of stalling. Every time I looked out the back window, that fence was there, sitting inside my yard like a dare. I'll be honest, that week got under my skin more than I expected. It wasn't just the land, it was the posture of it all. The idea that if they delayed long enough, maybe I'd get tired. Maybe I'd decide 6 feet wasn't worth the stress. Maybe I'd become the kind of person who says, fine, whatever, it's just to get peace back. But here's the thing about peace. It isn't peace if it comes from letting someone else redraw your boundaries. So, I stopped waiting for them to develop a conscience and called a property attorney. She reviewed the surveys, looked through the documentation, and said exactly what I already knew. I was right. She also said something else that mattered just as much. In disputes like this, speed often decides tone. The longer an encroachment sits, the more people mentally normalize it. She recommended a formal demand letter immediately, with a clear deadline for removal and notice that legal action would follow if they didn't comply. So that's what I did. The letter went out certified. It laid everything out plainly. The fence crossed onto my lot. The survey confirmed it. The encroachment had to be removed and rebuilt on the actual boundary by a specific date. If it wasn't, the next conversation would happen in court. That got their attention. 3 days after they signed for the letter, the husband knocked on my door. Different energy this time. No shrugging. No fake uncertainty. He asked if there was any room to work something out. Told him yes. Moved the fence. He asked if I'd consider selling that strip. I almost laughed. Not because the idea was impossible in theory, but because the timing told me everything. They had never wanted clarity. They had wanted convenience. Now that convenience had become expensive. They were trying to turn the theft into a negotiation. I told him no, not dramatically. Just no. He asked why. Told him because I wasn't interested in being pressured into a land deal by someone who only discovered they wanted my property after they built on it. That ended the conversation. The deadline passed. Then finally, the contractors came back. I happened to be home when they arrived, which felt appropriate. Same type of truck. Same kind of crew. This time, slower. Less confident. They started at the back corner, unscrewing panels, pulling posts, breaking out the concrete around the bases. I watched from the porch with a cup of coffee and no desire to pretend. I didn't enjoy the sight of expensive certainty being dismantled. Board by board, the whole process took 2 days. By the time they were done, the old line was gone and the new one, actually the correct one, was in place. The orange survey flags had come out again to guide the rebuild. And there, finally, was the backyard I remembered. Not bigger than it should have been. Not improved, just restored. That's the funny part about getting your own property back. It doesn't feel like winning in some dramatic movie sense. It feels like relief. Like finally exhaling after holding tension in your body for too long. I walked the line that evening, looked at the spacing, checked the landmarks. And everything made sense again. The neighbors didn't apologize. Not really. The wife made one comment a few days later about the whole thing being more complicated than expected, which is one way to describe building a fence without locating the property line first. The husband mostly avoided eye contact after that. Fine by me. We still live near each other. We wave sometimes in that stiff, minimal way people do when they've already seen each other in their least flattering roles. But every time, I mow that back section now. I think about how easily this could have gone the other way if I had let it. That's the part people miss. When they talk about these things like they're petty. They hear fence dispute and imagine two neighbors obsessing over a tape measure. But it's not really about lumber. It's about what happens when somebody decides the line only matters after they've crossed it. The fence wasn't the real issue. The mindset was, build first, ask later. If there's a problem, maybe the other person won't want the hassle. That's what they were counting on. They were wrong, so I'm curious what you would have done. If someone built the fence first and decided to look for the property line later, would you have handled it the same way? Would you have gone straight to a survey? Straight to a lawyer? Tried harder to keep it friendly? Because I've thought about that part too. And the truth is, I did try to keep it simple at the beginning. But once the answer becomes well, it's already built. You're not dealing with a misunderstanding anymore. You're dealing with someone hoping the cost of fixing their mistake will become your burden instead of theirs.